Imagine walking into your kitchen and finding nothing familiar. No refrigerator humming in the corner, no stove waiting for the turn of a knob, no microwave to rescue yesterday's leftovers, no running water from the tap, no electric lights overhead, and certainly no grocery store just minutes away. Yet somehow, for thousands of years, people still managed to prepare breakfast before sunrise, feed entire families, preserve food for harsh winters, and create meals that became the foundation of cultures around the world. Long before modern kitchens transformed cooking into something faster and more convenient, preparing a single meal demanded planning, patience, and hard physical work. Every ingredient had to be gathered, grown, hunted, or traded. Every fire had to be built by hand. Every pot, knife, and spoon represented valuable craftsmanship rather than inexpensive household items. Cooking wasn't just another household chore, it shaped the rhythm of everyday life from dawn until dusk. The kitchen itself looked very different depending on where and when you lived. A Roman family, a medieval English farmer, an ancient Chinese merchant, and a Native American village might all be preparing dinner in completely different ways, using different fuels, tools, and recipes. Yet despite those differences, they all faced the same challenge: turning raw ingredients into safe, nourishing food without any of the technology we now take for granted. Perhaps even more surprising is that many of the techniques people relied on centuries ago are still used today. Baking in clay ovens, smoking meat, fermenting vegetables, grinding grain by hand, and cooking over open flames have survived because they worked remarkably well. So, before modern kitchens filled with stainless steel appliances and electric conveniences became ordinary, how did ordinary people actually cook their daily meals? The answer is a fascinating story of ingenuity, tradition, and relentless daily labor, one that reveals just how much effort every bite once required. Long before kitchens became separate rooms filled with cabinets and countertops, the most important feature of nearly every home was a fire. Without it, daily life simply stopped. Fire provided warmth during freezing winters, light after sunset, protection from predators, and most importantly, the ability to cook food. In many ancient and medieval homes, the hearth wasn't merely part of the house, it was the center around which the entire household revolved. Keeping that fire alive was a full-time responsibility. Starting a new fire from scratch using flint, steel, friction, or ember stones could take considerable effort, especially in damp weather. Because of this, families often tried to keep embers glowing day and night. Before going to bed, ashes would be carefully piled over the hot coals, insulating them until morning. At sunrise, those hidden embers could be stirred back to life with fresh kindling, saving hours of work. Fuel was another daily concern. Wood had to be cut, chopped, carried, and dried. In regions where forests were scarce, people burned peat, dried animal dung, straw, reeds, or charcoal instead. Every fuel burned differently, producing different amounts of heat and smoke. Experienced cooks learned to judge temperatures not with thermometers, but by watching the color of the flames, listening to the crackle of the fire, and feeling the heat with practiced hands. Early cooking rarely involved precise recipes. Pots were suspended above flames using iron hooks, balanced on tripods, or placed directly among glowing holes. Bread might be baked beside the fire, while soups slowly simmered for hours in heavy clay or metal vessels. The fire itself became the cook's greatest tool and greatest challenge. Too much heat could burn precious food, while too little left meals undercooked. Mastering fire meant mastering survival. Every successful meal depended on understanding one of humanity's oldest and most powerful discoveries, turning simple flames into the foundation of everyday civilization. Before supermarkets, refrigerated trucks, and year-round produce, cooking began long before anyone lit a fire. The hardest part of making a meal was often finding the ingredients themselves. For most families throughout history, food was deeply connected to the seasons, local landscapes, and the amount of labor they were willing or able to invest each day. In rural communities, much of the food came directly from nearby fields and gardens. Families grew grains like wheat, barley, millet, oats, or rice, depending on the region. Vegetables such as onions, beans, cabbage, turnips, carrots, and peas filled small plots behind homes. Fruit trees provided apples, figs, olives, or plums when they were in season, while herbs added flavor to otherwise simple meals. Every harvest had to last for months, meaning people constantly planned ahead for times when fresh food would disappear. Meat was far less common than many people imagine. While wealthy households could afford frequent servings of beef, pork, or game, ordinary people often treated meat as a luxury reserved for festivals, holidays, or special occasions. Chickens were usually more valuable for their eggs than for their meat, while cows produced milk and oxen worked the fields. Slaughtering an animal meant losing a long-term resource, so families often waited until necessity made the decision unavoidable. Fishing, hunting, and gathering supplemented everyday diets. Rivers supplied fish, forests offered berries, mushrooms, nuts, and edible plants, while hunters searched for rabbits, deer, wild birds, or whatever local wildlife was available. Of course, success was never guaranteed. A poor hunting season or failed harvest could mean weeks of sparse meals. Trade also played an important role. Salt, spices, dried fruits, and certain grains traveled great distances through merchants, but these imported goods were expensive. Most households relied overwhelmingly on ingredients that could be grown or collected close to home. In a world without modern transportation, every meal reflected the surrounding landscape. People didn't simply choose what they wanted to eat, they cooked with whatever nature, the season, and their own hard work made available.
Today, opening a bag of flour or buying pre-cut vegetables takes only moments. In the past, however, preparing ingredients often required more time than cooking the meal itself. Nearly every item had to be cleaned, processed, or transformed by hand before it could ever reach the cooking pot. Grain was perhaps the greatest example. Wheat, barley, rye, or corn couldn't simply be harvested and baked into bread. First, the grain had to be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the stalks. Then it was winnowed, allowing the wind to carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back to the ground. Only after this lengthy process could the grain be ground into flour using hand-operated querns or large millstones. Turning enough grain into flour for a family's daily bread demanded strength, patience, and hours of repetitive labor. Vegetables also required careful preparation. Root crops needed scrubbing. Leafy greens had to be washed by hand. Beans often required soaking overnight, and many wild plants had to be sorted carefully to avoid poisonous lookalikes. Water itself had to be carried from wells, rivers, or communal pumps, making every rinse a deliberate use of valuable effort. Meat preparation was even more demanding. Animals had to be slaughtered, skinned, cleaned, and butchered without the benefit of refrigeration. Every usable part was carefully saved. Fat became cooking grease, bones flavored broths, intestines could be cleaned for sausage casings, and hides were preserved for leather. Waste was a luxury few families could afford. Even simple kitchen tools required constant attention. Knives had to stay sharp, wooden bowls needed cleaning, grinding stones wore down over time, and clay pots occasionally cracked from repeated exposure to fire. Nothing was disposable. By the time the ingredients were finally ready, much of the day's work had already been completed. Cooking itself was only the final stage in a long chain of labor that began hours earlier and reminded people that every meal represented the combined effort of an entire household.
A modern kitchen drawer might hold dozens of specialized utensils, but for most of history, families owned only a small collection of cooking tools. Every item had to earn its place because replacing it was expensive, and many households passed their cookware from one generation to the next. Rather than relying on convenience, cooks learned to accomplish almost every task with a handful of well-made essentials. The cooking pot was undoubtedly the most valuable tool in the home. Early pots were crafted from clay, which distributed heat evenly but could crack if heated too quickly. Later, wealthier households acquired bronze, copper, or iron cauldrons that lasted much longer and could withstand direct contact with fire. A single large pot often handled nearly every meal of the day, from boiling grains and vegetables to simmering soups, stews, and porridge. Iron skillets and griddles gradually became common in many regions, allowing cooks to fry foods or bake flatbreads directly over hot coals. Clay ovens baked loaves of bread, while spits turned large cuts of meat over open flames. In simpler homes, sticks or sharpened branches sometimes served the same purpose as expensive metal roasting equipment. Preparation tools were equally practical. Heavy wooden cutting boards, stone mortars and pestles, grinding querns, wooden spoons, ladles, and simple knives formed the backbone of everyday cooking. Since steel knives were valuable, they were carefully maintained, sharpened regularly, and treated as prized possessions rather than disposable utensils. Storage also required creativity. Clay jars held grains, oils, and dried beans. Wooden barrels preserved salted meat, beer, or pickled vegetables. Woven baskets stored onions and root vegetables where air could circulate, while cloth sacks protected flour from moisture and pests. Without electric mixers, food processors, or measuring cups, success depended on experience rather than equipment. Skilled cooks judged texture by touch, measured ingredients by handfuls, and stirred heavy pots with practiced movements developed over years of repetition. The tools may have been simple, but in experienced hands, they were capable of producing remarkably varied and satisfying meals that sustained entire communities for centuries.
Although history often celebrates extravagant royal feasts, the average person lived on a much simpler diet. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, one truth remained surprisingly consistent. Most daily meals centered on grains. Whether transformed into bread, porridge, flatbreads, or rice dishes, grains supplied the majority of calories for ordinary people and became the foundation of civilization itself. Bread was especially important wherever wheat, rye, or barley thrived. In many households, baking was a weekly event rather than a daily one. Large batches of dough were mixed by hand, kneaded for long periods, and baked into sturdy loaves that remained edible for several days. These dense breads were often far heavier than the soft sandwich loaves people eat today. Stale bread rarely went to waste. It could be softened in soups, soaked in milk or broth, or toasted over the fire to create another meal. In regions where flour was scarce or ovens were uncommon, porridge became the everyday staple. Made by slowly boiling oats, millet, barley, rice, or cornmeal with water or milk, porridge was inexpensive, filling, and easy to prepare in a single pot. Families often ate it for breakfast, while leftovers thickened overnight and could be sliced and fried the following day. Flatbreads also appeared across countless cultures. Thin rounds of dough cooked quickly on hot stones, clay ovens, or metal griddles, making them practical for families with limited fuel. Unlike large loaves, flatbreads required little preparation and could be made fresh almost every day. Flavor came from whatever was locally available. Butter, cheese, herbs, onions, garlic, beans, or small amounts of meat might accompany these grain-based dishes, but the grains themselves remained the true centerpiece of the meal. During difficult years, people stretched their flour by mixing in peas, chestnuts, acorns, or other available ingredients. To modern diners, such meals might seem repetitive, yet for generations, bread and porridge provided dependable nourishment, proving that simple foods, carefully prepared and wisely managed, could sustain entire societies long before modern kitchens transformed the way people cooked and ate.
Before refrigerators and freezers, one of the greatest challenges wasn't cooking food, it was keeping it from spoiling. Fresh meat could turn unsafe within days, milk soured quickly, and vegetables lasted only as long as the season allowed. For families who depended on successful harvests to survive the winter, food preservation wasn't a useful skill, it was the difference between security and starvation. One of the oldest preservation methods was drying. Farmers spread grains in the sun until they contained little moisture, allowing them to be stored for months or even years. Fruits such as apples, figs, grapes, and apricots were sliced and dried, becoming compact sources of energy that could be eaten long after harvest. Herbs were hung from rafters to dry naturally, preserving both their flavor and medicinal uses. Salt was perhaps the most valuable preservative in history. By drawing moisture out of food, salt slowed the growth of bacteria and made meat and fish last far longer than they otherwise would. Entire communities depended on salted pork, beef, cod, or herring during seasons when fresh food was scarce. In many parts of the world, salt was so valuable that it became an important trade commodity, traveling hundreds of miles from mines or coastal saltworks. Smoking offered another reliable solution. Meat and fish were suspended above slow-burning fires, where heat and smoke gradually removed moisture while coating the food with natural compounds that discouraged spoilage. The process could take several days, but the reward was food that remained edible for weeks or months. Fermentation transformed ordinary ingredients into foods that lasted much longer. Cabbage became sauerkraut or kimchi, milk turned into cheese and yogurt, while grains and fruits produced beer, wine, or vinegar. These methods not only preserved food, but often improved its flavor and nutritional value. Every preserved meal represented careful planning months in advance. Families spent the abundance of summer preparing for the uncertainty of winter. knowing that today's hard work could determine whether everyone would have enough to eat when fresh harvests disappeared.
Modern kitchens often allow one person to prepare an entire meal alone, but for much of history, cooking was rarely a solitary task. Feeding a household required so much labor that nearly every family member contributed in some way. Age, experience, and physical ability determined who handled each responsibility, turning meal preparation into a shared daily routine. Children often began helping at an early age. Younger children gathered kindling, collected eggs, fetched water from wells or streams, picked herbs from gardens, or watched simmering pots while adults worked elsewhere. As they grew older, they learned to grind grain, knead dough, chop vegetables, and eventually manage the fire itself. These weren't considered special lessons. They were essential life skills passed naturally from one generation to the next. Adults divided responsibilities according to local customs and household needs. In many farming communities, one group worked in the fields while others prepared meals, cared for livestock, churned butter, baked bread, or preserved food for future use. During harvest season, entire families worked together because every hour mattered before crops spoiled or bad weather arrived. Large households often became remarkably organized. Someone fetched firewood while another carried water. One person stirred the stew as another baked bread. Even after the meal ended, the work continued. Pots needed scrubbing with sand or ash, utensils were cleaned, leftovers carefully stored, and preparations for the next day's cooking often began immediately. In wealthier homes, servants or professional cooks handled much of the work, but even they relied on teams rather than individuals. Massive feasts required bakers, butchers, scullions, pastry cooks, and kitchen assistants working together in carefully coordinated routines. Cooking also served as a time for conversation and storytelling. Families exchanged news, taught practical skills, shared recipes, and passed along traditions while working side by side. The kitchen became more than a place where food was prepared. It became the social center of the home. Every successful meal reflected cooperation. Long before labor-saving appliances existed, feeding a family depended less on speed and more on the combined effort, knowledge, and teamwork of everyone under the same roof.
When people picture historical cooking, they often imagine towering banquet tables covered with roasted animals, elaborate pastries, and endless goblets of wine. While such feasts certainly existed, they were reserved for kings, nobles, wealthy merchants, religious festivals, weddings, or major celebrations. For the overwhelming majority of people, everyday meals were far simpler, but no less important. A typical family's daily menu changed very little from one day to the next. Breakfast might consist of leftover porridge, coarse bread, or cheese. Midday meals often included soup or stew, with vegetables, beans, or grains providing most of the nourishment. If meat appeared, it was usually in small portions used to flavor the dish rather than serve as its centerpiece. Supper was often another modest meal eaten before darkness made work impossible. This routine may sound repetitive, but consistency was valuable. People knew how much grain remained in storage, how long preserved foods would last, and how to stretch limited supplies through changing seasons. Waste was avoided whenever possible. Yesterday's bread became today's soup. Leftover vegetables found their way into stews, and bones were boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of flavor. Special occasions, however, transformed the table. Religious holidays, successful harvests, weddings, and community festivals offered rare opportunities to enjoy roasted meats, fresh pastries, rich desserts, or expensive spices. These meals were memorable precisely because they were uncommon. Families spent weeks preparing for such celebrations, saving their finest ingredients for moments meant to be shared with relatives and neighbors. Food also reflected identity. Recipes, cooking methods, and family traditions passed from parents to children across generations. Even when ingredients changed because of trade, migration, or climate, familiar dishes connected people to their ancestors and communities. In many ways, history was shaped not by grand banquets, but by ordinary meals prepared day after day. These humble breakfasts, lunches, and suppers fueled farmers who harvested crops, craftsmen who built cities, sailors who crossed oceans, and workers whose daily labor gradually transformed the world.
Today, preparing dinner can take less than 30 minutes. A refrigerator keeps ingredients fresh for days, clean water flows with the turn of a faucet, and modern appliances handle many of the tasks that once demanded hours of physical effort. It's easy to forget just how extraordinary these conveniences really are. For thousands of years, cooking was one of humanity's most demanding daily responsibilities. Before a single bite reached the table, someone had gathered firewood, carried water, ground grain into flour,
harvested vegetables, preserved food against spoilage, tended the fire, and carefully prepared every ingredient by hand. The kitchen was not simply another room in the house, it was the engine that kept the household alive. Despite the hardships, people developed remarkable solutions to everyday challenges. They mastered fire without thermometers, preserved food without refrigeration, baked bread without electric ovens, and created nourishing meals using little more than simple tools, experience, and patience. Many of these techniques have survived for centuries because they were both practical and effective, reminding us that innovation did not begin with electricity. Perhaps the greatest lesson from these early kitchens is that cooking was never just about food. It brought families together, passed knowledge from one generation to the next, strengthened communities, and reflected the traditions of every culture. Every loaf of bread, every simmering pot of stew, and every carefully preserved harvest told a story about the people who prepared it. The next time you switch on a stove or open a refrigerator, it's worth remembering the countless generations who accomplished the same goal under far more difficult conditions. Their kitchens were filled with smoke instead of electricity, muscle instead of machines, and patience instead of convenience. Yet from those humble hearths came the meals that nourished civilizations, supported empires, and sustained humanity long before the modern kitchen ever existed. And that's the strange, fascinating history of how people cooked their daily meals before modern kitchens changed everything.